Okay, welcome all. And I am Wendy Weiss. I am the Programs and Membership Coordinator here at Westside Unitarian Universalist Church. And welcome to our Sunday morning worship. And the Reverend Carol Badeau was supposed to be here, and she had a family emergency, so she's not able to join us. So I will be reading her words for the sermon today. And also David Howell is our worship associate, but we've had some technical difficulties, so I will also be reading in place of David today. So thank you, David, for all the work you did, and welcome all. Again, we are Westside Unitarian Universalist Church, and we welcome all to our services, to our community, no matter where you come from, no matter what your background is, no matter how you identify. And I would like to begin our opening with our chalice lighting. And this is what is required. How shall I enter the Eternal's presence? Shall I come with sacrifices? Would the eternal care for rams in thousands, or for oil flowing in myriad streams? What does the eternal ask from you? But to be just and kind. And as is our practice, I would like to invite us all to arrive into this space, into this time together in a spirit of contemplation and reception. And so I would like to invite the singing bowl to sound as we begin this time together. So today we are in the middle of what has started as the election, and we're a couple weeks after the election now, and though there is more clarity right now than there were a few weeks ago, the process of certifying this year's election results is not done and will be in process for a while. So we still have some uncertainty and some tumult in the nation. And one thing is clear, though, there's a strong division in our country and some pretty different opinions about what it means to be American, what makes our nation great, and whether we consider it great at all. These sorts of things have been on many of our minds. And it seems like a good time to talk about recent statements by our denomination about how Unitarian Universalism can be a part of rebuilding unity and stability in America. But let me give you some background information first. And again, these are Reverend Carol Badeau's words. So about 3.5 years ago, there was quite a shakeup in our denomination over the hiring of a person not from the South, specifically a white male from the North, to lead the southern region of the UUA. Given that the denomination had been claiming it was working to create racial equity in its practices, this did not go over well, and it quickly resulted in the resignation of a number of key leaders in our denomination, including our president at the time, Peter Morales. In his place, 2 African American ministers stepped in to lead the UUA. Previous denomination president, Reverend Bill Sinkford, and Reverend Sophia Betancourt. And one of the first things they did was create a group to study racial justice in the actual structures of Unitarian Universalism, our congregations, our leadership, denominational hiring practices, and a number of other aspects of how we function. That committee, the Commission on Institutional Change, issued its report this summer after extensive data collection. They also relied on the help of an outside social research firm to support the analysis of that data. You can find that entire report titled Widening the Circle of Concern, both as text and as an audio recording on the Commission's website. And it's also available from the UUA bookstore. One of the core messages of this report is that we as a collective need to uphold ourselves accountable for greater cultural competency around justice issues. And that report defines cultural competency in this way. Cultural competency can be defined as the ability to comprehend, interact, and communicate with individuals regardless of their cultural background. Cultural competency includes an awareness of one's own cultural views, working at and developing positive attitudes towards cultural differences, and having a knowledge of varying cultural worldviews and practices. We'll be talking more about the details of this report in the future, including important demographic changes that mean how we do church is changing. But for this introductory conversation, we're going to talk about some basic messages about racial justice in our congregations. The report tells us pretty clearly that some among us believe we can continue the practices that have been most prevalent without change. Others, many whom are younger, Black, Indigenous, people of color, or hold other identities marginalized in UU communities, feel it is critical for us to change. Some believe that work to promote equity, inclusion, and diversity is optional. Others believe it is a form of spiritual practice that is necessary to live out our faith. The report encourages us to attend to consider how our society is based on economic structures rooted in the annihilation of Indigenous people and the enslavement of Africans. And to remember that we are unprepared to live our values because we have not developed cultural competency, which is increasingly essential in the age of internet and social media. So, just what exactly does it look like to become culturally competent? And what does it take to be culturally competent? There are, of course, many complex and interconnected skills, practices, and attitudes that are essential to cultural competency. But I'm going to oversimplify a bit today and start us with considering a few basic steps that we can begin with. First, we can begin with open minds and an attitude of curiosity. It can be easy to assume that we are already competent and hard to acknowledge that we may not be as skillful as we might like. So we can start with an attitude of listening, asking respectful questions, and being curious. Secondly, we can familiarize ourselves with the new terminology and patterns of language use. This includes understanding acronyms that might be new to us. Probably the most important of these is BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C. It stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, which is a way to identify the diverse groups that have experienced racial injustice in our society. The category also includes becoming competent in using our pronouns to support a culture that is inclusive to all gender identities and expressions. An excellent resource for terminology relating to racial justice can be found at the website of the Annie E. Casey Foundation in a blog titled Equity versus Equality and Other Racial Justice Definitions. So I'm putting that link here right in the chat box so that you can access that. So finally, becoming culturally competent includes inner exploration and self-reflection about how racial inequity has been part of our beliefs and identity, part of the organizations we support, and part of our larger understanding of reality. And in this area, the term that I want to call to your attention today is decolonization. In between the election and the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday, there's lots of talk about colonial America, the values of the founding fathers, and definitions of our nation based in the colonizing of North America in the 17th and 18th century. But understanding these things in terms of justice movements is important. And one of the most important concepts in movements towards justice and equity is considering dismantling the beliefs, the stories, and the structures that perpetuate what Native scholar Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz calls settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is the process by which an imperial power seizes native land, eliminates the original population by force and removal or genocide, and resettles the land with a foreign invading population. This was the norm from the 1400s to the early 1900s by most global powers, including England, Spain, France, and later the United States in its relations with the indigenous peoples of North America. Usually we talk about colonial America as a place where we threw off colonial powers who were oppressors. But then we forget to examine how our own nation itself became a colonial power, most dramatically in its conquest of the lands of Native North American tribes. But Dunbar Ortiz and others argue that this colonial conquest has been central to the American story from its inception to the present day. This may sound a bit shocking to you, especially if it's the first time you've heard such a description of our nation. Settler colonialism involves brutality, massacres, and what Dunbar Ortiz calls extravagant violence against civilians. Even more important, the power of a settler colonial framework really requires beliefs and stories that uphold that system. Usually the story says something like, we know how to do things better than the people we are replacing. We are special in some way that justifies our actions. This is called exceptionalism. The story often involves divine approbation and support, and mythic versions of historical events that reinforce the goodness of the colonial power. So we have stories about what America means: freedom, liberty, and justice for all, throwing off oppressive powers and creating a government that is rooted in fairness and democracy. Here's the beginning of our Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. When a long train of abuses and usurpations evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Two important concepts here provide foundations for our American story. First, governments are supposed to arise from those governed, and to provide for their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And second, oppressed people have the right to throw off oppressive governments. But what if you replace the colonists in the story with Native North Americans or African Americans? Can we say that the government of the United States arose from the consent of the governed and had their best interests at heart? Or that it provided for their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Of course, it's pretty easy for us to say, well, of course not, but that happened in the past, and we wouldn't do that now. But here's the catch. We keep telling the stories. How America was a wild country rather than a fully settled, highly managed social and political and ecological reality. That people who were held slaves, that people who held slaves were heroes, and that our motives were entirely good. We are inoculated with these stories and the values they suggest from our earliest days, and it is argued widely that these concepts are at the root of much of our persistent racial injustice, environmental destruction, and economic inequity. Decolonization, in its most literal sense, means actually giving land back to the people it was taken from. But I'm suggesting that we speak more metaphorically, while also understanding that BIPOC peoples do not consider this just a metaphor. So in the metaphorical sense, decolonization means questioning these stories, assumptions, and beliefs in our own hard heads and hearts. It means asking ourselves, well, what assumptions do I have that are rooted in those stories that shape my decisions and choices? It means asking ourselves, how is colonialism rooted in my behaviors and assumptions? And that means asking ourselves questions about our cultural assumptions. Today, I just want to introduce this concept because clearly we could talk about the specifics for a very long time. But let me give you just one example of colonial racial assumptions that lots of UUs consider just a good idea. Many UU congregations prefer calm, rational, neat worship services. We certainly don't prefer loud exclamations of Alleluia or preach it during our services. We don't really want folks flinging themselves on the floor and writhing around in spiritual ecstasy. And we assume, based on a whole set of cultural norms, that this is the better way to do things. But how might these assumptions be rooted in racial biases? UUs may think it's just common sense because we have a cultural value of intellect, of rationalism, of non-emotionalism. And isn't there a subtle but ever-present association of those emotional ways of doing things with BIPOC cultures? There are innumerable other cultural norms and assumptions that can be traced back to the colonial superiority narratives. And it's worth considering that possibly that our brains and hearts have been colonized. I know this is a lot to consider. I know that it might even be kind of threatening. And it is normal to have some responses to these ideas that include defensiveness, arguments for our typical ways of understanding the world, and feeling emotions of irritation or reactivity. But let's go back to our Commission on Institutional Change. They asked us to become more culturally competent, which means seeing things from a different cultural perspective. It means understanding what biases and assumptions we have about reality and how they differ from people of other cultural contexts. It doesn't mean hating ourselves. It just means asking ourselves some deep questions. This month is National Native American Heritage Month. And so next week, in advance of the Thanksgiving holiday, we'll be talking a lot more about Native culture, heritage, and the history of Indigenous peoples in North America. But for now, I encourage you to just keep your eyes and ears open for messages in advertising, in politics, in education, in all areas of your life that echo with those colonial messages. and try to be open to witnessing them as if you were outside of the culture, as if you could see them with fresh eyes and hear them with fresh ears. We all have the ability to understand the American dream broader than we have understood it in the past, perhaps even wider than those who settled here in previous centuries understood it. And we have the ability to generate even greater freedom and justice than we have perhaps considered before. May it be so. For our closing words, I would like to bring Robin Wall Kimmerer's words in. She is an author who speaks about the resiliency in context of our relationships with the land. So Robin Wall Kimmerer says, "The land knows you even when you are lost." So we also believe it's important to refocus and re-energize ourselves based on our relationships with each other, the land, and the water. When we decolonize these relationships, we no longer see ourselves as the center, because then we realize that we are but a piece of the larger puzzle. When we practice reciprocity, the art of giving and taking, we overcome isolation and fear, and we begin to build upon our gifts together. So we extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.